When Achilles dies outside the walls of Troy, he stays dead, no judgment, no return, no second chance. But when Socrates drinks the hemlock, he tells his friends his soul will journey onward, weighed, judged, and reborn. Greek philosophy traveled an enormous distance between those two visions of death. To understand that journey, we need to follow a trail of ideas stretching from the banks of the Ganges to the streets of Athens. The doctrine of reincarnation, souls judged after death, ascending or descending based on moral conduct, did not originate in Greece. It emerged first in Vedic India, traveled westward through Mesopotamia and Egypt, and reached the Greek-speaking world through Orphic and Pythagorean mystery traditions. Syncretism, the deliberate blending of different traditions into a new whole, had not yet occurred. By the 5th century BC, two radically different views of death coexisted in Greek culture. One was native, the other was imported, and they were structurally incompatible. The native Greek tradition, inherited from the Homeric and Doric world, held that death was final and absolute. Heroes like Achilles and Hector performed extraordinary deeds, won immortal glory on the battlefield, and then simply ceased to exist. No moral reckoning followed. No soul traveled onward to face judgment. Death meant the extinction of the person, courage, memory, and all. This was the inheritance of northern Eurasian steppe cultures. You fought, you died, and the story ended. The Orphic and Pythagorean tradition told a completely different story. Death was not an end, but a doorway. Souls were judged after death and reincarnated according to moral conduct, ascending toward divinity or descending even into animal form. The hero of this tradition was not the warrior but the sage, the initiate who purified the soul through knowledge and discipline. The ultimate fate was not oblivion but liberation from the cycle of rebirth, a return to the stars. These two worlds should have been irreconcilable, but Plato found a way to fuse them, and the result was revolutionary. He took Socrates and modeled him as a new kind of hero. Like Achilles, Socrates possessed courage, cultural significance, and a willingness to face death. But Socrates was a hero of knowledge and wisdom rather than violence and destruction. Then Plato grafted the Orphic moral cosmic framework onto this heroic archetype. Socrates' death now carried cosmic weight, not because he fell in glorious battle, but because his soul would persist, face judgment, and return. This was not accidental borrowing. It was a deliberate philosophical synthesis, a new moral cosmology that neither tradition could have generated alone. Plato embedded this synthesis in two of his most remarkable dialogues, one looking outward at the cosmos and one looking inward at the soul. The Timaeus is Plato's most unusual dialogue. The scholar Jowett called it a different building in a different style set off from the others. Plato usually shows little interest in the physical world. His philosophy lives in the realm of forms and ideas. Yet the Timaeus is devoted entirely to cosmology and natural philosophy. The reason? It is a protratic, an exhortation designed to turn its audience toward virtue. Plato uses physics not for its own sake, but as moral medicine. The mechanistic materialism gaining ground in Athens stripped the universe of purpose. Plato's response was to construct a cosmos that was itself moral, designed by a divine craftsman, ordered by reason, alive with purpose. At the summit of this moral physics stands a striking doctrine: the good soul may escape the cycle of death and rebirth and return to its native star. In Hindu thought, this liberation is called moksha, release from the wheel of birth and death. Plato reached a strikingly similar conclusion through his synthesis of Greek and Eastern traditions. The Timaeus is a hymn to nature that is secretly a sermon on how to live. If the Timaeus looks outward, at the cosmos, at nature, at the physics of moral order, the Theaetetus turns the lens inward, and it does so under the shadow of death. The dialogue opens with the news that Theaetetus lies wounded on a battlefield, near death. It closes with Socrates heading to face the legal charges that will end in his execution. Two deaths bracket the entire inquiry. This is not accidental framing, it is the architecture of meaning. Between those mortal bookends, at the very center of the dialogue sits a passage scholars have long dismissed as the digression. That label is misleading. It is the dialogue's center of gravity. This so-called digression is a sustained encomium, a formal speech of praise, celebrating the contemplative life over the active life of praxis. Praxis means the life of worldly action, politics, commerce, ambition. For Socrates, a human being is fundamentally a soul occupying a body. Bodies come and go, souls cycle through birth and rebirth. The inner life, knowledge, contemplation, self-examination, matters infinitely more than any worldly achievement. This is the core of the Theaetetus, hidden in plain sight. Step back, and the architecture of Plato's mature vision comes into focus. The Timaeus and the Theaetetus are complementary halves of a single project. The Timaeus faces outward, cosmos, nature, moral physics, the cycle of rebirth, the soul's return to the stars. The Theaetetus faces inward, soul, knowledge, contemplation, the examined life. One builds a universe that enforces justice. The other reveals that the path to justice runs through self-knowledge. Together, they answer the deepest questions: how should we live? Why does it matter? And what happens when we die? The audacity of this synthesis cannot be overstated. Plato took ideas born on the banks of the Indus, carried through Mesopotamia and Egypt, and welded them to the warrior ethos of Homer to produce something neither tradition could have generated alone: a moral cosmology in which the hero is the thinker, the universe enforces justice, and the examined life is the path to liberation. Plato didn't just borrow from the East or preserve the West, he built something new, a vision of the human soul as a traveler through lives and worlds, whose only real weapon is knowledge, and whose only real home is the truth. That vision shaped 24 centuries of Western thought, and it began with a single philosopher looking at two incompatible traditions and deciding to make them one.